Hello and welcome to my lecture recital entitled Tony Banks, A Life in Genesis and His Music. 1. Introduction. Tony Banks is an English songwriter and composer who is known for his elaborate range of pop and classical keyboard playing within the band Genesis. When Tony Banks co-founded Genesis at Charterhouse in 1967, and when Peter Gabriel was their lead vocalist, they went on to be a successful progressive rock band with a strong cult following. When Peter Gabriel left Genesis in 1975, drummer Phil Collins became their frontman, whilst Chester Thompson took over the drum duties for their live shows. According to what Tony Banks mentioned in the Genesis chapter and verse biography, in 1980 when they were recording their album Duke, the NME newspaper at that time was more interested in promoting punk, and journalists were much less favourable towards bands like Genesis, Yes and ELP, as they were fed up with the self-indulgent, long instrumentals and complicated musical passages that defined progressive rock. Although this did not affect the popularity of Genesis, Tony felt that the same journalists from the NME, who had then gone on to write for the mainstream newspapers, still hated them. Although the press in other countries were a lot better, Genesis in the UK had never quite recovered and were not regarded amongst the media as cool. Yet despite this, they have achieved top 10 hit singles as well as playing to sold-out stadiums across the world. In their own way, they have built up a loyal fan base and have been an influence on bands and musicians over the years that they have been going. They have sold over 150 million albums worldwide and were also inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2010. Tony Smith, their manager, said that we have never had a definitive album like Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon, as each album has been progressively more popular than before. It is unusual to have three members of a band who have had commercial success outside of Genesis. Firstly, there is Peter Gabriel, who has achieved hit singles with Salisbury Hill and Sledgehammer, and has been one of the founder members of the WOMAD World of Music, Arts and Dance Festival. Through his tours, he has also raised awareness for Amnesty International. There is also Mike Rutherford with his band Mike and the Mechanics, who have had hits such as Silent Running and The Living Years. And finally, there is Phil Collins, who has had the most successful career as a solo artist, record producer and actor. Guitarist Steve Hackett has had a moderately successful career with his solo albums and tours, including his Genesis Revisited shows since he left Genesis in 1977. However, Tony Banks' solo career has never taken off in the same way. The reason why I'm focusing on Tony Banks for this lecture recital is that he has never written a biography, as he is not keen on being the centre of attention. He has never toured as a solo artist or has had a top 10 hit single except with Genesis. He has remained an unobtrusive, strong backbone and perhaps the most musical influence within Genesis and those who like his music outside the band. He has recorded 8 solo albums, 3 of which have been of a classical genre. It is worth noting that although Tony Banks is the most reserved member of the band, what he has to say is worth hearing. In more biographical terms, this lecture will briefly discuss Tony Banks' early life and will mostly explore his time within Genesis up until 1975. I will look at the next 2 Genesis albums, which were produced by David Henschel. As part of the aims and the research question, we will look at sections from one pop classical crossover track from each of these albums and what influenced him musically and why he wrote them. These will be Madman Moon from A Trick of the Tail and One for the Vine from Wind and Weathering. 2. Early life. Tony Banks was born on the 27th of March in 1950 in East Hoathly in East Sussex and is the youngest of 5 children. His mother was a classical pianist who had a musical influence on him. At the age of 5, when he entered Borsall Private Prep School, his mother arranged for him to have piano lessons. As well as the usual piano scales, he had to learn 3 classical pieces a year, which he found quite boring after a while. When he entered Charterhouse School at the age of 13, he nearly gave up piano playing completely, as his current piano teacher, who was of a more traditional classical nature, had no time for him. Fortunately, Tony found a new teacher called Leonard Howcrow, who was more sympathetic to the more pop classical style that he wished to pursue. As well as learning the prelude in C-sharp minor by Rachmaninoff, which he did not play that accurately, he enjoyed playing pop songs and anything that came on the radio. He also liked the Beach Boys, the Beatles, and the Animals, and very early David Bowie. Under the strict regime of Charterhouse, with its beatings and cold showers, it was here that he met Peter Gabriel, which made life there a bit more bearable. They struck up a friendship and found they had a common passion for music, as well as enjoying playing tennis and sneaking out to the record shop. Tony would play the piano and Peter would sing. They would play songs by Otis Redding and Nina Simone, and a few of their own songs, which ended up being on the very first Genesis album. At Charterhouse, there were two bands which were formed at that time, the Garden Wall and the Anon. The Garden Wall was a jazzy blues outfit, and the Anon was more of a rock and blues band. Together, they joined forces, and through Jonathan King, a former pupil at Charterhouse, was signed to his publishing company, and they recorded two singles, The Silent Sun and A Winter's Tale. The lineup at that time was Peter Gabriel on vocals, Tony Banks on keyboards, guitar and vocals, Anthony Phillips on guitar and vocals, Mike Rutherford on bass and guitars, and Chris Stewart on drums. Jonathan King also came up with the band's name, which they were not keen on at the time, but they felt as they now had a record deal, they decided to stick with the name Genesis. 3. Time in Genesis up until 1975. The band felt that Chris Stewart was not up to standard as a drummer and was replaced by Jonathan Silver, who met Peter Gabriel at the Tutorial College in London, where he was also studying. In 1967, Genesis recorded their first album, From Genesis to Revelation. The album was released in 1968 and turned out to be a commercial failure. Tony Banks went on at that point to study maths and physics at Sussex University. Whilst he was there, he could not get to a piano as the building was under construction, so he wrote a few songs on the guitar. The Guaranteed External Sanctuary Man, which ended up on the track Supper's Ready, and Anyway, which ended up on The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. Genesis at that point was still rehearsing during the holidays, and some of them were at university or doing their A-levels. Some of them were also under pressure from their parents, as they thought that music was considered a fun hobby and they should knuckle down and get a proper career. Genesis was also coming up with longer songs, which did not suit Jonathan King's style, so they parted company, and at the end of the summer they decided to go professional. They replaced Jonathan Silver with their new drummer John Mayhew, and in 1969 they moved to a cottage in Dorking, courtesy of Richard McPhail's parents, who was the singer in the Anon and later became their roadie until 1973. It was at the cottage that they began work on their next album, Trespass. Through an intense period of living together and not having a very active social life, except when they played a handful of gigs, they began to develop their identity as songwriters and instrumentalists. On this album, they mixed musical styles ranging from light acoustic folk pop pieces along with longer instrumental sections. Tony Stratton Smith later signed them to the Charisma label, and they recorded Trespass, which was produced by John Anthony and was released in 1970. Trespass was not a commercial success in the UK or the US. However, it reached number 1 in Belgium. In 1970, Anthony Phillips sadly left the band due to physical and mental health reasons. His songwriting, 12-string guitar, vocals, and his enthusiasm made an enormous contribution to the band at that time, and for a period they thought about splitting up, as they felt they would not be able to carry on without him. However, after much discussion, they decided to carry on with a different guitarist and a new drummer. Phil Collins joined the band in 1971, and they replaced their guitarist with Steve Hackett. They recorded their third album, Nursery Crime, which was again produced by John Anthony and was released in 1971. Phil's jazz rock style of drumming and Steve's more classical and ethereal guitar sound made an enormous difference to the general fluency within the band. Although they kept their lighter and more folksier pop pieces, in which one of them was to feature the first track sung by Phil Collins. They began to develop more of their progressive rock style, along with Peter's more elaborate vocals. Phil Collins would also sing backing vocals which complemented Peter's voice. Nursery Crime again did not sell that well in the UK, but did very well in Italy. Genesis as a live act were very well received in Italy, and they always played to enthusiastic audiences. It is also worth noting that apart from the album The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, recorded in 1974, Tony Banks played a 12-string guitar for the quieter instrumental sections and songs on the albums Trespass up until the Wind and Wuthering album. In 1972, they recorded Foxtrot, which was produced by David Hitchcock, and along with John Burns, who was also the recording engineer, they started to get a bit closer to how the band sounded live in the studio. The opening track, Watch of the Skies, features a great Mellotron keyboard intro from Tony Banks, which you can hear now. The album also features their great masterpiece, Supper's Ready, which is a collection of songs and pieces moulded together to make a 23-minute track. A standout example of this is the Apocalypse in 9/8 time. Phil and Mike are playing in 9/8 time, and Tony is playing in 4/4. It is a good example of Tony's classical pop playing over an E-bass drone, which is constant throughout this section. The ending part of Supper's Ready, The New Jerusalem, is also very heartfelt within the lyrics, which tackles the subject of fighting dark forces and overcoming evil with good. Not surprisingly, Foxtrot is one of Tony's favourite albums. Peter's costumes and the band's visuals now started to become a selling feature, and they were becoming more successful as a live act. Foxtrot reached number 12 in the UK charts, but it failed to chart in the US. However, it reached number 1 in Italy, which signified their popularity in Europe. Genesis brought out a live album which was released in July 1973. Their manager, Tony Stratton Smith, thought it would be a good idea to release it as a low budget price so it would be more accessible to buy in more stores. Banks, not keen on a live album, was not pleased to find it was going to be released as a single album, as it missed out their best track, Supper's Ready. Yet despite this, it was their first album to enter the top 10 in the UK, then reaching number 9. The next album, Selling England by the Pound, was recorded in 1973. The album's title represented an increase in Americanization and a decline of English folk culture. The British press felt that Genesis was putting too much effort in appealing to the American audiences, which you can hear within the lyrics of the opening track, Dancing with the Moonlit Night.
Can you tell me where my country lies? Said the unicorn to his true love's eyes. It lies with me, cried the Queen of Maybe. For her merchandise he traded in his prize. Paper late, cried a voice in the crowd. Old man dies, the note he left was signed Old Father Thames. It seems he's drowned, selling England by the pound.
Although the album does not contain as much emotion as Foxtrot, the band had much improved in their technical proficiency, which you can hear in tracks like Firth the Fifth and the second part of the Cinema Show, which is an instrumental in 7/8 time. On the album Selling England by the Pound, Tony Banks uses an ARP Pro soloist synth and a new Mellotron, and although the instrumental section of the Cinema Show is influenced by the jazz fusion group the Mahavishnu Orchestra, it remains very English within its sound. The album charted at number 3 in the UK and number 70 in the US. Genesis at that point were looking for a new manager who would help them sort out their general organisation both practically and financially. Although they were having successful album sales and were getting good reviews, they had accumulated debts due to their poor deal with the Charisma label, which needed drastic revision, and they were also spending too much money on their live shows. After much reluctance, Tony Smith agreed to manage them and has been successfully managing them up until 2022. In 1974, they released their double concept album, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. The story, which was devised by Peter Gabriel, is about a Puerto Rican youth in New York called Rael, who goes through a series of bizarre encounters as part of a journey of self-discovery. Peter describes the story as a modern-day Pilgrim's Progress and wanted Rael to be more of a rough and working-class character. Rehearsals for the album took place at Headley Grange, which is a historic Grade 2 listed building in Hampshire where Led Zeppelin had previously recorded. Unfortunately, the previous band, not Led Zeppelin, had left the house in a terrible state and had rats sauntering in the corridor and running up and down the wisteria, which was outside the house. Peter insisted on writing all the lyrics on the piano in one room, whilst the band came up with the music in another, which caused a few tensions. Tony Banks described it as his least favourite writing period within Genesis, even though they pulled all the ideas that they had towards creating the album. Tony had one fast piano introduction which Peter and Tony developed into a song which became the opening title track, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. This sadly was to be the last song that they were to ever write together. The band recorded the double album at a mobile studio in Wales, which was to be John Byrne's last production for Genesis, who had in the past produced their last album, Selling England by the Pound, and had also engineered Foxtrot. The Lamb peaked at number 10 in the UK album charts and number 41 in the US. Tony felt that the story on The Lamb was too complicated and much preferred the first two sides of the album musically, rather than the third and the fourth. He also felt that the album should have ended with a bigger musical climax, whilst instead it just sort of petered out. However, his favourite moments that he thought stood out on the album were In the Cage, which they still played for their live shows much later, the Grand Parade of Lifeless Packaging, the Carpet Crawlers, and Fly on a Windshield. There is also an experimental piece called The Waiting Room, which came out of a musical jam. Tony's playing on the ARP soloist synth is also very noticeable on the instrumental tracks such as Riding the Scree and In the Cage. Also, his use of the Mellotron choir very much rings out on the track Silent Sorrow in Empty Boats. Tony said that playing the whole of the concept album The Lamb on stage to an audience who had never heard it before did not go down as well, and felt that they wanted to hear the old favourites like The Knife and Supper's Ready. Also, there was no real decent digital piano sounds on the market in the early 70s like there are today. The RMI 368 electric piano that came out in 1972 that he was playing lacked touch sensitivity. And although it sounded okay on the title track, on songs like Anyway, which has a small dramatic classical section in the middle, trying to replicate this on the RMI did not have the same impact, and as a result it sounded awful, whereas on a normal piano it would have sounded a lot stronger. Yet despite this, and along with the tour having technical difficulties, The Lamb went down well to enthusiastic audiences, which you can hear on the Genesis 1967 to 1975 archive CD. It was a brave album and tour to attempt, and in later years, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway has given Genesis more of a cult following. Despite Tony Banks's persuasion, Peter Gabriel sadly left after announcing his departure at the Swingos Hotel in Cleveland during an American tour of The Lamb. A photo of Peter's last public appearance with the band was taken at the Savoy Hotel in London in August 1975. 4. Aims and research question. Pop classical crossover influences. We will now briefly look at two sections from one longer pop classical crossover track from each of the next two Genesis albums, which we will hear shortly. We will also, in very short detail, look at the musical influences behind them and the possible reason why he wrote them. Since there are now only 4 people within the band, there was much more opportunity for Tony Banks to write much longer songs for the two Genesis albums. According to the Something Else Reviews website, as well as the rock side, pianistically Tony was also influenced by Chopin and Rachmaninoff, which you can hear in the development of his longer pieces. The possible reason why he was able to write longer pieces might be that even though NME, back in the mid to late 70s, was promoting punk rock, it was still fashionable to come up with much longer, progressive and experimental material, which, for example, bands like Camel and Caravan were producing at that time. David Henschel, who was the producer on A Trick of the Tail until the release of the Duke album in 1980, was also a keyboard player and was getting into synthesizers, which influenced Tony a lot regarding the keyboard sounds that he used for these albums at that time. The first track we will now look at will be Mad Man Moon from A Trick of the Tail album, which was released in 1976. The two sections that I mentioned earlier will be the middle classical section leading into the rock fusion vocal part. The middle classical section has 2 themes. Here is theme A. And now, here is theme B. Theme B is again now repeated. You can hear the influence of Chopin and Rachmaninoff with the fast runs and triplets at the beginning of theme A. In theme B, the left hand takes the lead, followed immediately by the right hand. The ending of theme B then climaxes into the rock fusion part. This demonstrates the mixture of classical and rock influences. We will now hear the ending of theme B going into the jazz vocal fusion part. The next track which I will demonstrate will be the final instrumental section of One for the Vine, which comes at the end of the final verse. The first part has a slow classical rock feel, which has quite simple chords. The music builds to a very Rachmaninoff climax. Then after the pause, it goes into a final piano solo, which within its sound is reminiscent of a Chopin classical piece.
I've got a sort of feeling that most of this will be forgotten, really. You know, I think all pop music is really, it's a very contemporary thing. I mean, I'm amazed that some of it has lasted as long as it has, and I think it's only sort of from a historical perspective. I remember I was walking along Wardour Street, and this guy runs up to me whose hair was punk, and he wanted me to sign something, and he had, because he said, oh, fantastic, fantastic. And the only thing he had on him for me to sign was a copy of Pretty Vacant by the Sex Pistols. So I knew at that point, it's not built to last, this, and what maybe will last will not be what any of us will predict. You know, I'm pretty sure it won't be the people who have the headlines.